Video is looking at the impressions question for the EDUQAS GCSE English Language. There is one impressions question on the exam. It can be questions 2, 3, or 4, and it'll be worth 5 or 10 marks. Obviously, you need to know how many marks it's worth, because that will reflect how long you spend on it and how many quotes we need. So impressions means the opinion or view you might have of the place or person when you read what is said about them. So you can have any opinion you like of the person, as long as you back it up with a quote. And it's all about picking out verbs and adjectives to stand out and saying the effect on the reader. So Norman, who is the main character, this video is going to be looking at an extract from the book and the film Psycho. His name's Norman Bates. And if we were looking at these two quotes, we're probably not going to say a hell of a lot about the first one, because replied is a bit of quite a bit of an objective word. It's not particularly sort of passionate, doesn't really stand out. But ranted, we may be zooming on that, and that would maybe tell us that Norman is feeling aggressive or angry at his mother. So do some simple examples first. So if I said, what impression do you get of the girl when she's presenting her speech? I felt my cheeks go red when I started to give my speech. What impression or what view would you have on the girl? So you might say nervous, you might say embarrassed. Yep. So that's probably what I would go for. But if I changed it to the girl raced onto the stage and grabbed the mic, you might say that she's excited or eager to give the speech. So again, I'm picking out the words and saying what it tells me about the person. Or I was shaking like a leaf when I started to give my speech. Again, what would this say? I would say it might say that the girl is nervous. So the way to structure your answer would be, you need 3 parts really. You need the question, you need the impression, and you need the quote. So I've put, I get the impression she's very nervous with the quote. He was shaking like a leaf. As it's a simple quote, I don't need to explain any further. If it was a more complex one, I'd go into a bit more detail, but not a lot of detail. Remember, the EDUCAS exam is all about quotes. So we want a lot of quotes with little explanation, as opposed to 1 or 2 quotes with a huge explanation. So again, link to the question, impression, then I give my opinion, then I back it up with a quote. If I didn't do the yellow, if I didn't back it up with a quote, I won't get a mark. You can swap the blue and the yellow around, so you can put the quote first, then give the impression. That's absolutely fine. So again, what impression do you get of the girl with I rolled my eyes? You could probably talk about 2 separate things in this one. But again, rolled my eyes, what impression does that give me? That maybe she's frustrated, she's made a mistake. A big tip I would give to students, particularly if this impression question is worth 10 marks and you're looking for 7 or 8 quotes, see if you can find 1 or 2 quotes that are so simple that you don't need to explain, you can just embed it into the sentence. So say, for example, it was the same question about the presentation, and the quote was, I was bored during the speech, you can literally put, one impression of the girl is she was bored during the speech. It's such a simple quote. You don't need to analyze it. You don't need to go into detail. Just shove it in the sentence. Okay, so if we look at the extract, I might put the film in the video. If so, it's about 3 or 4 minutes long. Just fast forward if you don't want to watch the clip. I'll see if I can do that. If you don't see a video clip of this, it means I haven't been able to use the copyright. So Psycho, okay, so it was a book by Robert Bloch, and it's turned into, it's been done a film a couple of times. So one in the I think it was 1960, and another film sort of in the 90s. And what it's about is a character called Norman Bates, and he gets wrapped up in a murder. Okay, so the question is, what impressions do you have of Norman and the Bates Motel? So if you've not seen the clip, if I set the context of the clip is, a woman called Marion Crane has stolen some money, and she's driving across the country to meet her lover with the money. And she gets caught on a really stormy night, and she needs somewhere to stay. She's gone off the motorway, the highways, because she doesn't want to be spotted by the police. So she has to find a hotel. And here is the video clip. So fast forward if you want to fast forward. Okay, so again, the question is, what impression do you have of Norman and the Bates Motel? So it's 2 things. So if I was doing 7 or 8 quotes, this is a 10-mark question. See if you can do maybe 4 of each. So yeah, that's Norman Bates, and that is the Bates Motel. So I'll read it through, and as I read it through, either skip if you want to read it yourself, or if you were listening to me read it, see if you can just maybe mentally underline a few quotes that you would say, a few opinions you'd have of Norman, and a few opinions of the Bates Motel. Her hotel here in the middle of nowhere, impossible. She closed her eyes and opened them again. Yes, it was true. A small sign shining in the night. Bates Motel. There were no other cars outside the motel, and the office was empty. Marion stood outside the office and waited. Looking up, She saw a large old house on a hill behind the motel. On the first floor of the house, she could see a light in the window. There was a shadow moving behind the curtain, the shadow of a woman, Marion thought. At last, through the darkness and the rain, she saw someone outside the house. It was a man, and he was running down the hill towards the motel. Marianne got out of the car to meet him. He was a young man, tall and thin, with a friendly, boyish face. "I'm sorry I wasn't in the office," he stuttered. "Do you have a room?" Marianne asked. 12 rooms, all of them empty," the young man laughed. "Come into the office." Inside the office, the young man watched her carefully as she wrote her name in the visitor's book. Then he thought for a second before choosing a rusty key from the small cupboard covered in cobwebs behind the desk. "Room 1," he smiled. "It's next to this office." The young man carried Marianne's suitcase from the car, and she followed him into her room. He turned on the light and opened the window. "Thank you, Mr. Bates," Marion smiled. "My name's Norman," he said. "If you want anything, I'll be in the office. I just want to sleep, but before that, I need to eat. There's a restaurant about 10 miles away, but I was just thinking," he said, lowering his eyes with a shy smile. "Maybe you'd like to have dinner with me instead. Nothing much, just bread, milk, and cheese. But you can come up to my house with me if you like." "You're very kind," said Marion. Norman looked up, his eyes shining with excitement. "I'll be back when everything's ready." Marion closed the door behind him and smiled. What an eccentric young man, like a little boy. Marion heard a loud voice. It came from the big house on the hill. She went to the window and listened. It was the angry voice of an old woman. "No, you can't bring strange young girls up here to this house." "Mother, please," Norman replied. "First you bring up to the house, then what? Music after dinner? Holding hands and kissing?" "Mother, she's just a stranger. She's hungry and it's raining. She's not having food with my son in this house. Do you understand, boy? Are you going to tell her, or shall I come down and tell her?" "Shut up," Norma cried. "Shut up." So we go back to the start of the extract. What I would do in a perfect world, if I was in the exam, I'd have two highlighters, one for Norman and one for the Bates Motel. So if we go through Norman on this slide first, and then we go through the other slide. So yeah, things that give me impressions of Norman. So really simple. He was a young man, tall and thin, with a friendly, boyish face. Remember, if you're doing 8 quotes, you don't need 8 impressions. So I think a theme of this extract is that Norman does look young. He is immature. So you can maybe make that point and give me 3 or 4 quotes to prove it. So boyish face, meaning he looks young, tall and thin. He stuttered. Maybe this is telling me that he's shy talking to Marion. Maybe he's nervous talking to her. And then the last yellow one is the young man carried Marianne's suitcase from the car. So you could say that he works in a hotel. He's been quite professional. He's been quite chivalrous. He's gone out and got the Marianne's suitcase for her. If we look at the Bates Motel now, straight away, first sentence, it's in the middle of nowhere. So that is one where maybe you don't have to explain it. There was no other cars outside the motel, so that tells me that Marion is the only customer there, and the office was empty. So Norman, probably because he doesn't get any customers. It's so quiet at the Bates Motel that he doesn't even bother staying in the office because there's no point. He may as well just stay in the house and then occasionally run down. There was a shadow moving behind the curtain, the shadow of a woman. So quite interesting how the writers put not the woman first, but the shadow first. So almost like an ominous, bit of a gloomy, bit of a threatening atmosphere already. 12 view rooms, all of them empty. So again, that's telling us that the Bates Motel, no one is there. If this was a different kind of question, you'd probably be fearing for Marion at this point. She's there on her own. Rusty key from a small cupboard covered in cobwebs. We'll talk about that one. If we go to the next slide, let's go back to Norman again. Just bread, milk, and cheese. So this maybe adds to immaturity. It probably shows his maybe lack of experience with women, where he seems to be quite interested in Mariam, but instead of like maybe fine cuisine or like a steak meal, it's almost quite immature food, bread, milk, and cheese, almost like a little boy maybe would have. Norman looking up, his eyes shining. Again, that's a little bit of a boyish thing. And what a centric young man, like a little boy. We'll talk about that in a second. And then towards the bottom, a bit of a change in a bit of a change in Norman, where even though he seems a bit strange, but quite a nice guy, when he meets his mother, it sort of changes. He becomes very whiny, even more immature. And the verb at the bottom, cried, it's not Norman replied. Even though he's saying shut up to his mum, it's not saying Norman yelled or Norman shouted. Cried, again, links back to being almost like a baby. Bates Motel for this slide. Again, there's a restaurant 10 miles away. Again, it adds to the fact it's in the middle of nowhere. Marion's very isolated. And even though it's not you could still include the fact the mother in the Bates Motel impressions. So a loud voice, an angry voice, again, She's a bit of an intimidating woman, a bit menacing, and even the fact at the end she's making Norman upset, which we don't like as the reader. Also, I haven't highlighted right at the top about Norman. They say he's shy, so that would be an easy one. So if we go into ones, just a few about Norman. So Marion says, "What an eccentric young man, like a little boy." So so what does eccentric mean? So eccentric, be that human dictionary, what does that word mean? It means unconventional and slightly strange. So I've put one impression I have of Norman, the quote eccentric, is that Marion thinks he's going conventional and slightly strange, but literally the definition. And then the second one, like a little boy, she uses a simile. She thinks he's immature, as she calls him, like a little boy. Okay. Not one about the Bates Motel. It says it's a rusty key from the small cupboards covered in cobwebs behind the desk. So again, think to yourself, what does that tell you about the Bates Motel? So if it's rusty, not been used in a while, yeah. Cobwebs maybe show it's not that clean. Again, people maybe have not been in the room, so cobwebs haven't been disturbed. So I put one impression I have with the quote, rusty key, ellipsis covered in cobwebs, is that it's not clean and may have been empty for some time. So maybe you could pause the video. Again, it's a 10-mark question. I tell my students to go for 6 answers. And really important as well, if you're someone who's trying to push grades, you could maybe do a couple of quotes where you comment on the change of impression you have of Norman at the Bates Motel from the start of the extract to the end. So if I was looking at this, I maybe would be talking about at the start. He seems sort of quite like maybe a bit of a strange guy, but also sort of quite innocent, quite like a nice, sort of warm-hearted guy. But by the end of the extract, we see a bit more of a submissive, a bit of a weak side to him with his relationship with his mum. So feel free to pause the video and see if you can come up with a few yourself, and I'll go through some answers. Okay, so the ones I came up with were, again, that thing. If he's immature, if he's young, it doesn't have to be one quote per impression. If there's lots of quotes that tell you he's immature, put them all in. So I put my first impression of Norman is immature. As Marion says, he's like a little boy. That's what we talked about. Then I've added more. He also described as looking young and having a boyish face. And then I've linked the food choice to his immaturity as well. And I put his food choice is also infantile. Instead of having more mature taste to try and impress Marion, he can only offer up bread, milk, and cheese. Also, it's good to use the word impression in the question and even indicate my first impression. Another impression I have of Norman with the quote eccentric is that Marion thinks he's unconventional and strange. We did that one. I think he seems shy and nervous talking to Marion as he stuttered when speaking to her. Remember, you don't have to say impression each time. Your sentence starter can be I think or I feel. However, he seems courteous and professional in his work as he carried Marion's suitcase from the car. Again, we see his immaturity with Norman's interactions with his mum. The mother pleas suggests he's pleading with her, and he gets angry. He cries when he doesn't get his own way. He can only show displeasure by acting like a child. And then I've done that thing where I've maybe talked about a difference from Norman from the start to the end of the extract. So I put overall, our impressions of Norman change from beginning to the end. He goes from a polite young man to a pouting, immature child. If we look at the Bates Motel one now, my first impression of the Bates Motel is that it's in the middle of nowhere. It is so isolated that the nearest restaurant is over 10 miles away. I think it seems an unpopular hotel with few guests. There are no other cars, which tells the reader that Marianne is the only guest. Also, the office is empty, which suggests there are so few customers that Norman seems no reason to man the office. This is shown to be the case as Norman tells us that all 12 rooms are empty. One impression I have of the motel with a quote rusty key covered in cobwebs is that it's not clean and may have been empty for some time. And my final impression is the house by the hotel seems dark and threatening. Marion doesn't see any people in the house on the hill, but only a shadow. This gives the hotel an ambience of fear and gloom. This introduces Norman's mother as a menacing presence. This is emphasized by her loud, angry voice, which infantilizes Norman. He cried is a good example of that. So there you go. So I've got about probably almost 10 quotes, some really easy, and then some where I've delved in. That is really going to get you the marks. Remember, each quote, each answer should basically, what's the question? Impression. Give me an impression you have of Norman at the hotel. Back it up with a quote. Remember, you don't get any marks if you won't back it up with a quote. And if I want to push myself, maybe towards the end of my answer, give me one of those where I talk about a development in the character, a change in the character from beginning to the end of the extract. So I hope that's been helpful for you. Leave a comment if you have any questions.